Well, amen. I do love Shasta Bible College, without a doubt. It is the highlight of my speaking year, and I can't believe you keep bringing me back for 5 years. You are a glutton for punishment, and you've gone through 4 talks this morning, and you're ready for another one. So thank you very much. It's a delight, and everyone's a delight. You always make us feel very welcome and at home, and the students are a delight. And I've given up on my son recruiting one of these gals from Shasta Bible College. Not due to the gals here. I'd take one home in a second. Myself, my wife, not to replace you, but maybe we could take a wife, but I'm not. No, I've given up on my son because, if you want to get a gal, the first thing you got to do is you got to be willing to talk to a girl. I mean, you got to kind of like show a little guts here and talk to her. And I just can't get him to talk to girls. It's a hard thing, even though he's in the Navy and he's not a wimp or anything like that. But you just gotta go up and say something like hi. So it's a toughie. It's a toughie to do. And besides, he's a millennial, and millennials seem to have a sense of entitlement. And so it's like they're entitled to a wife. Well, no, you got to go out and work for it. So I'm tired of doing all the heavy lifting for him. So that's, you wanted an update on my son? That's it. He's somewhere in the Pacific Ocean right now, so he's out of email touch. He can't get anything from me, so that's a good deal from that. He's on the USS Nimitz, which is stationed up in Seattle, Washington. So he's not too far from here, and they'll be leaving in June for an 8-month deployment. And he says the rumors are they're going to be hanging off the coast of China and North Korea, doing something there. I didn't do that. So anyway, it was Mahaya, or whatever you were called back there, Mathua. So, all right. Well, when you look out at nature, and you look at living things in particular, do they look messy, or do they seem to be well-designed? Well-designed, of course. And they don't look like they're the product of tinkering, at least to this audience right here. But to many people, they do look like they're the product of tinkering, and to many people, they even look a little messy. Even to some creationists who have bought into this, they see biology as quite messy. And there's even some resistance to this push I've been doing of trying to bring some engineering principles into biology to explain things in a very rational engineering way. So since I have 3 back-to-back mornings here, we're going to go through a series, and we're going to develop, starting with today, a biblical principle for engineered adaptability. Tomorrow I'm going to explain to you what engineered adaptability is, Lord willing, and Friday we're going to go through at least 10 examples of how organisms are engineered to adapt, and not a single one of them is going to involve a struggle for survival of the fittest. It's not going to be a death-driven worldview. And hopefully this will liberate your thinking on this whole area, because if organisms could not adapt, if they could not adjust, then a theory of evolution could never get going. But because they can adjust, then someone can devise a theory of how they evolved over time. So adaptation, or a better word from an engineering standpoint, the ability to self-adjust, because adaptation's been polluted by the evolutionists. So please work into your vocabulary that organisms self-adjust, showing where the emphasis of the ability is in the organism that God gave them to different environments. So with that, that's where we're going to go. So today we're going to start out with an exposition of one of the passages which talks about organisms being designed. And you know the 2 passages, Psalm 19, verses 1 through 6, and Romans chapter 1, verses 18 through 25. And we're going to do an exposition. So this will be totally new. Exposition of Romans chapter 1. And I will read to you the text in good King James English. And then I'm going to do what a good Bible preacher would do, and that is he'll take the text, which is meant to be concise, and expound for you some of the word meaning, some of the tense of the word, whether it's a statement of fact or not. All of those kinds of things. We'll try to elaborate on those. And in Romans chapter 1, there's two areas which are kind of open for interpretation, and I'll give you my interpretations. But otherwise, everything is pretty much pretty straightforward. So, look at that, a white board right there. Romans chapter 1, verse 18 to 25. We all know, it says, "For the wrath of God is what? Revealed from heaven against all ungodliness and unrighteousness of men who hold the truth in unrighteousness." We've probably memorized that verse right there. So it begins, God's wrath. It's revealed against several things, ungodliness and unrighteousness. So probably people wondering, what's the difference between ungodliness and unrighteousness? Well, there is a huge difference, and it's smart that Paul begins with ungodliness, because ungodliness is not sinful behaviors in and of itself. It's a disrespect for God. It's an irreverent disregard for Him. And do you realize that's where the vast majority of humanity is right now? They just disregard God. That's where I was when I was lost. I wasn't a God hater in the sense that I went out to Him and opposed Him like Richard Dawkins. I just had no regard for God, and I disrespected Him in His position. Now let me give you a quick illustration of disrespect for someone in their position. You know, I was in the Air Force, and I'm retired from the Air Force, and down in southern Texas in San Antonio is the recruiting base. It's a Lackland Air Force Base. So all new recruits, all no-stripers come to Lackland Air Force Base for basic training. And I was in the hospital down at the pharmacy waiting to pick up some meds, and outside the pharmacy on the wall was a picture of the President of the United States. Then there was a picture of the Secretary of Defense, the Chief of Staff of the Air Force, a 4-star general. Their pictures are right there. Right behind me in line was a no-striper, a brand new recruit, and right behind him was a Chief Master Sergeant, an E9 in the Air Force. And from out of the blue, for no apparent reason, this no-striper said of the Chief of Staff of the Air Force, "I don't know why they put his picture up there. He puts his pants on one leg at a time just like I do." You know, it's like, wow, basic training isn't doing what it's supposed to these days on that. And I looked over him, and I looked at the E9, and he had the same look of quite disappointment on his face that I did. And I was thankful that he's there, because I would have to correct him unless there is a senior enlisted there who would correct him. And he did. He called this young no-striper out of line, and they went behind the corner, and I could forcefully hear this young guy getting a chance for correction on that, about how, respect for this position. Well, there's a drop of that poison in every one of us who doesn't want to respect someone over us. And then we always want to take them down a notch. Sometimes it's by calling them by their first name. We don't even call them Pastor Jones anymore. We just call him Jim or something like that. There's a drop of this poison in every one of us which doesn't want to respect somebody or somebody in a position over us. But we should, because this is really of Satan, who was the original disrespecter of God's position. So ungodliness, even though it is not wicked, sinful acts, it's a bad thing to have no respect for God's position. Well, it's also revealed against, just right here, unrighteousness, which is sinful behavior. Those are the sinful behaviors. And then, of course, it's against those who suppress the truth. It says they hold the truth. It means they have, like, literally a stranglehold. And the King James says they suppress the truth in unrighteousness. But if you expound the Greek, it's saying they suppress the truth, which itself is an unrighteous act. So ungodliness, wicked acts, and the mere fact that you are trying to hold down the truth, that is also a wicked act. So in these three things, God's wrath is against it. Now, this is the part that needs a little bit of interpretation. It says, God's wrath is revealed from heaven. From heaven. Now, that's an interesting one. How do you know How does anyone know when God's wrath is revealed from heaven? I mean, do you have a meter out there that says, okay, here's a God wrath detector. Oh, there's a little wrath. There's a little wrath. How do you know when God's wrath is being revealed from heaven? It's kind of subject to interpretation. The thing is even though we don't have a meter that detects it, people seem to sense it when God's wrath is out there. Here's an interesting headline. Oh, it's a little washed out here. Even scientists unwittingly see purpose in nature. Now, they're not seeing purpose in terms of design. They're seeing purpose in why things happen. And the text said this, that there's an underlying belief in meaning. I'll blow it up for you a little bit. The team, this is based on a study. The team says their results of their study hint at an underlying belief in meaning behind natural phenomena that persists from early development. The study seems to build on previous research suggesting that the desire to turn to God for an explanation for disaster is widespread. It's a widespread human urge. A poll last year found 44% of Americans think that natural disaster can be a sign from God. Now, a lot of these people aren't even believers, but they sense when something bad is happening, maybe God's mad at us for something. There's this inner conviction. You know why? Because they've been doing something wrong, and they're caught. And they sense that maybe these things are bad, and they are a judgment from God. Well, that's probably a good inner hint. I know one person who definitely thought of that, and that was Abraham Lincoln. In fact, if you go to the Lincoln Memorial, the entire wall, the entire north wall, has this, his second inaugural address on it, which is very, very short. Very short. And his address is probably something that none of the presidents would give today. It's an explanation for why the war has come. And he begins, "We all knew that slavery was the cause of the war." Bang. Right out. But none of us thought it was going to be as bad as it was, and none of us thought it was going to go on as long as it was. So slavery was an offense, and this is what he says. "If we shall suppose that American slavery is one of those offenses which in the providence of God must come, and has brought this wicked war on us," which he says both sides now, North and South, because the war was still going, are praying that it would quickly end, and that the death would quickly end. He said this, "Yet, if God wills that it continue until the wealth piled by the bondsmen's 250 years of unrequited toil be sunk." In other words, he says, if everything you got by exploiting these people is now just destroyed, and until every drop of blood drawn by the lash shall be paid by another drawn by the sword, as was said 3,000 years ago, so it must be said today, the judgments of the Lord are true and righteous altogether. There's a man who's under conviction. He knows why this is happening. He senses the wrath of God as being revealed from heaven. From heaven. Now here's just a little fun fact. Here's Abraham, where is he here? Here's Abraham Lincoln giving his address. Who's this dude peeking his head out over the parapet? That's John Wilkes Booth right there, stalking him. Not like the Hollywood stalkers. Anyway, so God's wrath is being revealed against those who suppress truth. So, what is this truth? Well, Paul is going to develop it, and he's going to explain the truth. He says, because that which may be known of God, some things are certainly known of God. That, in the Greek, is just some things which may be known of God. And he says they are certainly knowable. They are definitely known of God. He says, because he has manifested in them, and he has shown it unto them. Now, when Paul says he has manifested it unto them, he is using a word which means it is very well known from human experience. In other words, you can look at something and you can immediately detect what it is based on all of your experience. And he's saying because we can see something and immediately detect what it is, God is revealing himself to us. Now, what's interesting, as we go through this text, almost all of the actions of God are going to be in the passive voice. That God is not up there saying, okay, here I am, revealing himself directly. He's revealing himself indirectly through the creation, passively revealing it. And almost all the actions by humans are going to be in the active voice. We are actively doing something in response to that. So that's the general view here. Well, God says, I'm revealing myself by stuff you can just look at and immediately see what it is on that. So, these are not really paraphrases, these are how I would translate that. They are undeniably evident to everyone. Which takes us to the key verse, verse 20, which we all know, which says, For since the creation of the world, his invisible attributes are clearly seen, being understood by the things that are made, even as eternal power and Godhead, so that they are without excuse. Now, none of the English translations gets it in the order that it comes out in the Greek, because this is kind of a hard verse to translate. In the Greek, it starts out like this: invisible attributes from creation of the cosmos, understood, things made, clearly seen. That's how it comes out in the order of the Greek. And it makes a lot of sense to put it that way. So he is saying, literally, that there are attributes of God which cannot be seen. So that's a good translation. These are invisible attributes. Invisible attributes. And then he picks up that they are understood from the creation. God creates the material realm. Now, in this term, the creation actually can be translated several ways. It can be translated as a creature. It can be translated as the creation, or it can be translated as the act of creation. The act of creation. I think this is what is referring to here. It's the act of creation because he's going to say he created the world, the cosmos. Now, cosmos can also be translated into English in various ways. We might talk about, in the sense that where John says, love not the what? The world, or the things in the world. And that's cosmos. It's a world system. So it can be translated as a world system. But it also can be, for God so loved the world, the entirety of mankind. Or it can refer to the world that we're on, or it can refer to the sum total of all of creation, the entire material realm, everything that we call nature. Nature. And I think this is what Paul is referring to here in this area, that we can see these things through God's act of creating the material realm. And he says they're understood. They're understood by the sense of studying them or reflecting on them. And you think about them, and it has the idea of having an intercontemplation where you sense something is true. Well, what are you studying? What are you seeing that you sense is true? It says, the things that are made. The things that are made. Now, if you have your text out, that is the key phrase. Everything in this text spins on that being true. So let's take a moment to flesh that out. Things that are made. It comes from the Greek word, which it generally refers to human handiwork or human craftsmanship or human workmanship. So there's something about workmanship and craftsmanship which has a real distinctiveness about it. There's something about this clicker being made which has definite features there. But in this case, it's being used of God. And this word is only used of God in the New Testament. It's only used twice. Here, and the other time is in Ephesians chapter 2, verse 10, where it says that we are his what? Workmanship. His workmanship created in Christ Jesus. So what Paul is saying, you know these things through inner contemplation. And you remember, he said the first verse, they're manifestly plainly at first sight. You just recognize them. And what do you recognize at first sight? You recognize God's workmanship, his handiwork. That sounds like Psalm 119. The heavens declare the glory of the Lord, and the firmament shows his what? Handiwork. His handiwork. So we are sensing the handiwork or the workmanship of God. And we are able to easily see this. And when we see that, he says they are clearly seen. In fact, the Greek means it is so clear that you can actually make a deduction about it. You can conclude certain things. It is that plain enough that you can make a conclusion. And Paul says you can conclude what? You can conclude his invisible attributes. You can conclude his invisible attributes. Is this laying it out for you, how it's all going to fit together? In fact, he says, as you look at creation, you see two invisible attributes. And you know what's really cool? When he says they are clearly seen, it's a play on words, two invisible attributes. He begins, invisible attributes, something which can't be seen, and now he says it is clearly seen. So he's making a play on words here in this contrast. Something that is never visible, you can actually clearly see it. And you can clearly see these invisible attributes. First, you see his eternal power. Eternal power. Now, the word we translate eternal also means unending or everlasting. So we see God's unending power. Now, the word for power, every one of us has heard messages about that. It's dunamis, from which we get our English word dynamite, which means a lot of power. But in terms of creation, that's not even the most important point. It's not that he has unending power and lots of it, but there are two types of power. One is a delegated power. I can delegate you power. Therefore, I give you power to do something. That's what we find a lot in the military, delegated power. But another type of power is inherent power. Something that is never delegated to you. You have it in and of yourself. And that's what dunamis means. It is an inherent power. So it is literally saying God's unending, inherent power. So that's what we see when we look at this creation. And then it says his Godhead. Now, that one I think needs a little bit of interpretation. How do you look at creation and sense his Godhead or his divine nature or his divinity? Well, I think we have to turn to a couple other passages which refer to people looking at nature and concluding things about God. And right there is Psalm 104, verse 24, where it says, the works of the Lord are basically multifaceted. There's a way about them in which he is able to balance all different kinds of competing needs. It says the works of the Lord are multifaceted. In wisdom you have made them all. Wisdom means skillfulness. So he makes a bird's bone really strong, but he also makes it light. You're balancing competing needs of strength with lightness. And we can see this all throughout nature. We see a wisdom of the Lord. And then also in Psalm 92, verse 5, if you're taking notes, he says, the works of the Lord are great. The works of the Lord are great, and your thoughts are very deep. So there's a profound intelligence in the things of the Lord. So there's a wisdom, there's an intelligence, there's a purposefulness in living things. And we see all of that. So this is my interpretation. When we look at nature, we see these elements of wisdom, great insight, intelligence, purposefulness. We see that in living things. And we're able to see all of that. But most important, between all of these together, we're able to deduce this. Sorry, it's at the bottom of the picture here for some of you. God's agency creates nature. That is the bottom line point that he wants everybody, and he says everybody does see when they look at nature. They see that it's God's agency which creates nature there. Well, let's flesh out this whole idea a little bit deeper of what it means to see God's handiwork. How do we know handiwork? How does handiwork relate to engineering principles? I mean, is there even any connection? Well, there's a huge connection. First of all, everybody sees God's handiwork. Here's an interesting paper just published a few years ago. Creationism feels right, but that doesn't make it so. The subtitle is better. Psychological researchers suggest that evolutionary thinking is unnatural. Is unnatural. This is obviously Scientific American, a very worldly evolutionary publication. But they realize it's not natural to think things evolve. In fact, this paper quotes a study of people all around the world, and particularly children. And what's interesting is if you take children between the ages of 6 and 10 years old from any culture on the planet, wherever they are, and you hold up to them a cat or a dog, and you say to these kids, where did this come from? You know what the natural answer for all children generally is? God made it. God made it. They intuitively see wisdom, purposefulness, even though they can't put it into words. They sense that. And then it takes years of education to work this natural tendency out of them, to brainwash it out of them. And that's why he says creationism feels right, but doesn't make it so. Well, what are we able to see when we look at nature? Well, one thing we're clearly able to see is where things that natural processes are able to do stop, and things that intelligent processes are able to do start, even if you're using the exact same materials. You see, you look at this and you can clearly see, oh, natural processes did this, but intelligence did this, even though you were building it from this. You're able to see it. So people instantly recognize these things. Well, what are they instantly recognizing? Well, they're recognizing characters of human craftsmanship which are distinctive. And you see them in all kinds of stuff. This is the world's most sophisticated artificial hand, which is being put on military people which have had their hand blown off. Sensors, all kinds of things. Heat sensors, pressure sensors, activators, motors, all kinds of cool things in it. Obviously, an engine has features of design. And look at this little, it's kind of washed out here, this little insect there on the guy's fingertip. But it's not an insect. It's a robot. It's a tiny little robot with a tiny little motor in it. And it flies around. And it's got a tiny little television camera in that. And someone can fly this around and spy on people. This thing was in Trump Tower. I mean, it was like right there. And I think Obama was flying it, well, anyway, I don't know that. But you see all those things. Well, what are we looking at? Well, here's a long list. This is what you know you're seeing, but you haven't been able to put into words yet, but after this talk, you will be able to put into words. You see numerous interconnected parts, don't you? You see a particular arrangement of those parts, proper alignment, precise timing, exact dimensions and shape, tight fit, balance. There's a way you have to put them together in order for them to go together right. You see all of these things. Now you know how to put these into words. Even though when you look at an engine, you're intuitively seeing this, you just don't know how to phrase it. Now you do know how to phrase it. Well, this is what's interesting. Everything on this list, when you look at a human hand, you see interconnected parts, precise timing, all of those things. Hearing apparatus, you see them. The eyes of all kinds of creatures, we see them. Look at this. This is a microscopic blow-up of gears, two little gears that are on the back legs of a plant hopper. A plant hopper can jump like 10 times its body length. And it has to have both the back legs launch at the same time so it doesn't go shooting itself off course. Well, how does it launch them both at the same time? There's a series of gears that the muscle activates the gears and they move together and launches it. I mean, how many of you people don't see gears? Don't think of intelligent sources. And then here's tiny little machines, motors with rotors and stators and shafts and U-joints and all the things we see on man-made things. We see these exact same characteristics. And that's why Paul says he's manifested in everybody. In other words, you look at it and you instantly recognize it for what it is. Everything depends on people being able to do this with living things. And because they correspond so well to man-made things, because we know this had a designer, when you see the same things in living things, you are on the hook to conclude that this had a designer as well. That's why this all fits together. Well, I'd like to propose that probably the same engineering principles which describe how man-made things self-adjust are the exact same principles we can use to analyze living things. And there's no mystery or magic about it. God is going to use these principles and they're going to function and they're going to operate. Maybe the same way which cars are able to adjust their speed up and down hills, birds self-adjust their beaks to fit different environments. Wow, there's some really important ramifications. First of all, even the lost and unbelievers are recognizing this. This is an engineering biology conference held just last year. And look how they begin it. Engineering models, methods, concepts, technologies, and engineers themselves are playing an increasingly prominent role in biological investigation. The new engineering-inspired fields such as integrative systems biology, biomedical engineering, and synthetic biology appear to have more in common with engineering approaches than with traditional biological, i.e. evolutionary-driven ones. Wow, they see this. Here's a long quote by Mustafa Kamash, but I want you to see everything he sees in his research. He says, we have also found that despite their vastly different substrates, biological regulatory mechanisms, that is, living things, and synthetic counterparts, man-made things, used in engineering share many similarities, and they are both subject to the same fundamental constraints that govern all regulatory mechanisms. The architectures of both cellular and engineered regulatory networks exploit sensors to measure disturbances and regulated variables of interest. And they used measured signals to induce action that regulates the outputs of interest through a network of feedback and feed-forward loops. Notions used in the study of engineering control systems such as optimality, nonlinearity, robustness, isolation, modularity, and feedback are invaluable for understanding biological complexity. So clearly we can reduce these things to engineering terms. Now let me clarify. I'm not talking about life, what life is. Do you know why? Because life doesn't reduce to biology. Life is an immaterial thing which is given to us from God. Your life doesn't reduce to biology. That's why if I needed to, I could give a kidney to Dr. Nicholas there. He's not going to suddenly start thinking like me and acting like me. He'd probably say, praise God. But on that, I'm not transferring that. I'm giving him a functioning thing whose function can be explained in engineering terms. And that's why it fits in you on that. Wow. So what are some biblical and some other applications? First, the fact that people can clearly see this is that engineering principles up there, rooted in design-centered thinking, are essential. They're not an augment to explaining biological things. What I'm saying is if you really want to understand biology, you better start with the fact that it's designed. And begin with the belief that it's designed, or you're not going to get on the right track to explain its function ultimately, no matter how proper your observations are. You're going to end up with the wrong conclusion. Second, the exact same principles for designing and building man-made things can be used to analyze living things. And that's how we know they are designed. Because you can reverse engineer this, you can know it's designed. But I can take a kidney and I can reverse engineer a kidney. Therefore, I can know it's designed. That's very important. People need neither a special key to understand God's design, nor are they beyond the capability of humans to decipher them, though it may take a lot of hard work. In other words, God says it's clearly seen to anybody who's lived on this planet at any time. That includes even very, very smart researchers. So in order to figure out how that happens, you're not going to need some special revelation from God. Everybody will be able to figure it out. It's going to take some hard work, but you should be able to figure out how it works. Environments do not have mystical powers over living things that they don't have over man-made things. Oh, this is a toughie. This is even one that creationists struggle with. Creationists struggle with this. Because I'm alive and I'm a part of nature, suddenly I'm beginning to think that nature can do things to me, and nature can change me, and nature can do things that it couldn't change this clicker. But that's wrong. Natural things cannot change this clicker in and of themselves, and they can't change me in and of themselves. That's a toughie. Creationists, because we are made to work so closely with nature, but that can be explained. You think nature's working on me, but nature's not working on me. Cogitate on that for a moment. And then finally, if the language describing how man-made things self-adjust or originate would sound silly, then we should not apply that language to God-made things. Not only would it sound silly to God-made things, it would be blasphemous. Nothing went into this clicker that didn't pass through the mind of the engineer who made it. And nothing went into me that did not pass through the mind of my engineer who made me. It doesn't come directly from the environment into me no easier than it went directly to the environment to here. And just as nothing was naturally selected by some magical selector to build this, nothing in nature can naturally select anything to build me either. Here, give me an example. Here comes a space shuttle. It's trying to make its way in through the atmosphere, and it makes a successful landing. Here comes another space shuttle. This is a true story. It burned up in the atmosphere, and everybody was killed. I come to you, the engineer, I'm your boss, and I say, explain to me why this happened. And you say, well, the environment favored this space shuttle, but it disfavored this one. Or the environment selected for this one, and it selected against this one. Do you see, from an engineering standpoint, that sounds stupid. Stupid. And you'd lose your job. But when it comes to biological things, when we explain how it happened, you say nature favored, worked it on, acted, selected, and you personify nature. We shouldn't do that with God-made things. It would be just as insulting to the engineer as it is to the ultimate engineer to give that kind of credit. Wow, it's probably likely that God is pleased when we copy His designs and put them into useful human technologies, which we do all the time, provided He is given the credit for that. And it is also likely that God is not glorified by stumping us. In other words, ha-ha, this is so complicated, you can't figure it out. Now you know I'm God. The other way around. You can figure it out, and you know that it is complicated, and as soon as you figure out that thing, it opens the door to 10 more things to discover. And as soon as you discover those 10 things, they each open up a door to 10 more things to discover. And the discovery just goes on and on and on and on and on. That's how God gets His glory. And this is revealing something to us about God. In fact, a research program was picked up about a decade ago looking at DNA that wasn't coding for proteins. They're wondering, what does this other DNA do? Some called it junk DNA. Well, researchers actually found lots and lots of function for that DNA, and this was one of those researchers. He said in Nature, yet with thousands of types of cell types and growing sets of tools with which to test them, the project that he was working on could unfold what? Endlessly. We're far from finished, said geneticist Rick Myers. Quote, you might argue that this could go on forever. And that worries some people because someone's got to pay for it on that. Wow, what a picture of the infinity of God. You never hit an end of discovering things from His Word. You never hit an end from discovering things from His works. Wow, it could go on forever. Well, that's all because of this key phrase. We understand by the things that are made, which now in your mind you're always going to think of as what? Handiwork or workmanship. We understand it by His handiwork. His workmanship. And we can conclude that God is the agent in creating nature. Wow, that's only half the exposition. Because Paul says that's the truth explained, but then he also says there is a suppression of the truth. A suppression of the truth. He says, because when they knew God, they knew Him, the Greek says they knew Him for some time. They actively knew Him for some time. Because when they knew God, in other words, everybody starts out knowing by their experience with natural things that there is a God. It says they glorified Him not as God, and neither were they thankful. Glorified. Now that's an interesting word that needs to be explained. The root for glorify, to glorify something, initially means to form a good opinion. To form a good opinion, or to acknowledge, or to credit. Now, isn't that the basis for glorifying something? If you do something and I don't even give you the credit for doing it, I will never glorify you. So, fundamentally, it means to acknowledge someone's actions or to credit them. So it says, even as they did not like to credit God, they didn't credit God for those things. So they didn't credit the Creator. And there was a definite article in the Greek, the Creator, God, as Creator. This is exactly what we see today. Nobody is giving credit to the Creator God as the Creator. And it says, and neither were they thankful. Well, this is very, very important as it relates to the things that God's wrath is revealed against. Because when you don't credit the Creator God, and you're not even thankful to the Creator God, may I suggest that is the very basis for disrespecting Him and irreverently disregarding Him and living as if there is no God, is that you don't even credit Him and you don't even thank Him for what He's doing on that. And then it says, so they are without excuse because they knew this, and it says their foolish hearts were darkened. The seat of their emotions, the seat of their understanding lost its ability to perceive correctly. And then Paul says, and they changed the glory of the uncorruptible God made like unto corruptible man. You know, the Greek doesn't mean they changed it. It means they exchanged it. They exchanged the glory. They exchanged the credit due to the uncorruptible God made like unto corruptible. What does that mean, corruptible? Well, corruptible means subject to decay, subject to wearing down, and subject to breaking apart. Well, what in this material world, you know from Dr. Hawking and Dr. Morris's lectures this morning, is subject to decay? Everything is. The entire material realm is subject to decay. So what Paul is saying here is they exchanged the credit from the one who is not subject to decay, who is immaterial, this immaterial God, and they exchanged it for representations of the material realm, made like unto man and the birds and the four-footed things and the reptiles. They're exchanging this credit of the immaterial God made like unto material things. Material things. And Paul says, professing themselves to be wise, they became fools. Professing or claiming that they are wise, they became what they claimed were, it's in the dative sense, the product. So they are claiming that they are the product of knowledge. In other words, they are the experts. They're claiming that they are the product of knowledge. It says they became fools. It's in the passive sense. They slid into foolishness. So they're claiming that they are the product of knowledge, all the same time they are sliding into foolishness themselves. On that. So they change that. And then it says, and therefore they exchange the truth of God for a lie. Now this is an interesting construction here. This whole text in verse 25. They exchanged the truth of God. It's just, in the literal Greek, they exchanged the true God. The true God. and for the object of exchange. Now the Greek word here is different from exchange in the verse 2 verses earlier. This word means exchange in the sense of forfeiting something good for something bad. They're exchanging something good for something bad, and the good thing that they're exchanging is the true God for the pseudo. The pseudo. That just means the false. Bauer, Art, and Gingrich in their lexicon explains this thoroughly. In the context, they are exchanging the true God for the false God. Not the lie, some evolutionary lie. They're just exchanging the true God for the false God. And then he explains, how do we know this? He says, and they worshipped and they served the creation. Now that construction in the Greek, this and, can be translated not only worshiping, in this sense it's a passive worship of nature, not only worshiping nature, but also serving nature. Now this is an active sense in the Greek. They actively served, and the Greek word here is only used in the New Testament of service in a religious sense, latruo. Service in a religious sense. So he said they exchanged it for the false God, and they adored or they worshipped the material realm, and they reverently served the material realm. What are people worshiping and adoring today? Nature. I saw some of you mouth it. Nature. They worshipped and they served this natural realm. And then it says, rather than, the Greek word means contrary to. It's an adversarial sense. Contrary to the Creator who is blessed forever. Blessed means praised. It's from the Greek word where we get the word eulogy, to praise or to adore. Well, he's praised by what? God is praised by what? This is the irony that's caught in this passage. He's praised by his handiwork in creation. So what Paul is saying is they're worshiping and adoring the very thing which is praising him forever. They've perverted it. They've perverted it. What should really be being praised and glory to the Lord now has become their object of veneration and worship. And so this is the conclusion. Nature becomes credited with creative activity to create itself. That's the lie. That's the suppression of the truth, and that's how it's revealed. Well, how do we see this? Well, obviously, you see it when you turn on Nova, you turn on National Geographic, you turn on any of these shows. Do you see an overt nature worship coming out of those programs? Of course you do. It drips from the pages that you read. It drips from the television. You see this overt nature worship. Let me show you where you see it in literature. Stephen Hawking, purported to be one of the smartest men on the planet, he said, because there is a law such as gravity, the universe can and will, what are the key words? Create itself. Create itself from nothing. Spontaneous creation is why there is something rather than nothing, why the universe exists, why we exist. So, summarizing everything, either God creates nature or nature creates what? Itself. And this is what Paul is outlining in this passage. God creates nature, that's the truth. Nature creates itself, that's the suppression of the truth. That is the lie. That becomes the false God. I suggest to you this is a nature creates itself statement. I know it's true because he says it. It creates itself. Right there. How they do it by natural selection. But this is the key thing. This book, Plausibility of Life, written by two evolutionists, very, very important. He, Darwin, accepted the view that the environment directly instructs the organism how to vary. How to vary. The environment is instructing the organisms. It's shaping them. Organisms were like modeling clay. Oh, Christians, this is the most important part. God says, I made these creatures to go through space and time, taking on challenges. The nature creates itself says, the challenges as creatures go through space and time shapes them. You know, most Christians are missing this, and many creationists are missing this. In this externalist view, organisms are modeling clay. Nature is the what? Modeler. Making them. And on and on and on. If organisms needed wings or legs or whatever it is, natural selection would bring it about. That's what he's saying. Therefore, even though we don't agree with everything Dembski says, he's quite perceptive in this summary. In naturalism, the view that nature creates itself, what then constrains the reproduction of living things in nature? Clearly, nature itself. Nature, as it were, selects a word of volition, a word of intent. Those organisms that will reproduce and eliminates those that will not. Thus, according to Darwin, nature itself constitutes a supreme animal breeder that shapes the path of life. Now, if you were to go out to the book table and pick up this book, the Book of Beginnings, which I just got my copy of about a week ago on that, and you were to turn inside it, you would find a very insightful quote in this book. The author, who is Dr. Henry Morris, is quoting from Stephen Jay Gould, and he says, moreover, natural selection expressed in inappropriate human terms, i.e. can select, favor, act on, weed out, cull, all of those operative terms which we apply to humans are now being applied to nature. Is a remarkably inefficient, even cruel process. Remember I said it's a death-driven process. Selection carves adaptation by eliminating masses of the less fit. Do you really want to embrace a worldview that says this is how God creates? Imposing hecatombs of death as preconditions for limited increments of change. Natural selection is a theory of trial and error externalism. Do you know what he means by trial and error externalism? It's happening to you from the outside. Sometimes your traits work, sometimes they don't. If they work, you live. If they don't, you what? You die. Organisms propose via their storehouse of variation, and the environment disposes of nearly all. Not an efficient and human goal-directed internalism, which would be far more lovely, but nature doesn't know the way. What I'm suggesting to you is, it is internalism. God built it in, and that's how they solve these problems. And in fact, another intelligent designer said this, undirected materialistic causes, which was just argued by Stephen Jay Gould, have not demonstrated the capacity to generate sufficient amounts of specified information. At the same time, conscious intelligence has repeatedly shown itself capable of producing this information. The reason why I have to quote from intelligent design people is because creationists have been missing this whole idea of agency for decades. God's agency creates nature, nature's agency creates itself. And it is an argument over agency. And how do you know agency when you see it? You see what? Handiwork. You see workmanship. That is the evidence of agency. That is the evidence of agency, as you see the workmanship in nature. And this is how you would lay out this entire passage, where you come to these two conclusions. But Paul says there's one last thing. There's a condition of mankind himself. And he wrapped it up at the end of verse 20, and then he picked it up in verse 22, and then he picked it up in verse 24. He said, first of all, have to be down at the bottom, mankind is without excuse. He says they have drifted into foolishness in their minds. He says that their mental life was unable to perceive clearly related primarily to cause and effect. That they became deluded about wisdom and foolishness, and therefore God gave them over to lust-driven, degrading behaviors amongst themselves. And that's how this ties back all the way up to this area of the passage of the sinful behaviors. And that's why we see God's wrath revealed against the disrespect for Him, which goes to the suppression of the truth. It's against these sinful behaviors, which is a result of the suppression of the truth. And this is a very important passage. And we are going to elaborate on this, Lord willing, tomorrow on how organisms are able to engineer themselves. Amen? Amen. Over to you.